Now, when I mentioned Victorian politics, the first thought that likely popped into your mind was... Yeah, today Victoria is almost completely synonymous with hardcore left politics. From the fact that Labour controls 60% of the federal seats to the fact that the state Labour has won all but one election this century. However, what might surprise you is that it didn't used to be this way. In fact, before the year 2000, Victoria was actually considered a solid Liberal state. It was the last state in the Commonwealth to elect a Labour government, and it was the home of some of the biggest non-Labour Prime Ministers, from Alfred Deakin to Malcolm Fraser, and of course, the Silver Fox himself, Robert Menzies. So, what happened? How did Victoria go from being the bluest state in the Commonwealth to the reddest? Welcome to Red State, Blue State, the series in which I dive into the history of each state in the Australian Commonwealth from Federation until today, to learn about their political leanings and impact on wider Australia. So join me for episode 2 as we dive into Australia's second most influential state with Victoria. Now, just a reminder before we begin that this video was dedicated to my lovely patrons Thomas Johnson, James Rapp, Cameron Strauss, Tom Smarty, ARW, Edward Pierre, Darathinian, Echolocation, Sloan, Cody Jones, Quentin Walker, and Loom High. For as little as $3 a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Sawmod video, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content. Link in the description below. Diving into the first decade of the Victorian Parliament after Federation shows quite a mess, in which power frequently switched hands and hardly anyone was Premier for more than a year. However, by the year 1910, the multiple Liberal factions had merged into a solid bloc against the Labour Party, which, much like its federal New South Wales counterparts, had seen rapid growth over the elections of the early 1900s. In fact, the merger of the Liberal parties into one singular party was so successful, with the exception of a brief 14-day stint in 1913, Labour would be kept out of power until 1924, where Freak Deal with the Country Party scored them a minority government. Fun fact, George Prendergast, who led this minority government, was the oldest person in Australia to ever assume the role of Premier at 70 years of age. This made Victoria the last state in the Commonwealth to get a Labour government, even including the brief 1913 stint. The reality was, Victoria was not a state welcoming of a Labour government. Its large gold rush in the 1800s had left the state extremely wealthy, and the large green pastures of the countryside compared to the deserts of other states saw a much larger rural population than seen in other states. As a result, Labour found themselves stuck between the affluent cities of Liberal voters and the countryside full of pastoral country voters, with few industrial miners and labourers to get the votes to win government. As a result, Labour only found they were able to go into government by preying off the disunity between the Country Party and the multiple variations of the Liberal Party. This led to the downright insane situation where in 1935, the Labour Party under Tom Turnercliffe would offer confidence to the Country Party under Albert Dunstan. This strange alliance of convenience would last until 1943, where the party's differences would eventually get the better of them, thus ending one of the strangest coalitions in Australian history. Following the death of the Labour Country Coalition, Victoria would be plunged back into the chaotic premierships that had plagued the first 3 decades under Federation. With the newly formed Liberal Party and Country Party frequently winning similar numbers of seats in Parliament, debate on who should be the senior partner in the coalition saw the premiership switch back between the two parties until finally, in 1952, over 50 years since Federation, the Labour Party under John Cain Sr. finally won their first ever majority government. Finally, Labour had gained the ability to govern outright and no longer needed to give tons of concessions to the Country Party. Now with the majority, what would Labour do? Well, pretty much nothing, because 3 years into Cain's term, the entire party would explode due to the Labour Party split of 1955, which hit Victoria extremely hard. Labour would be confined to the walls of opposition for the next 27 years, while Henry Bolt and his Liberal Party would ensure an uninterrupted majority government thanks to the support of the former Labour Catholics in the DLP. By the way, when I say majority government, I mean never once did they need the Country Party to support them. So, by now you're getting the picture that Victoria is extremely blue state, from the lack of an industrial workforce to its high percentage of farmers and white-collar workers. Heck, well I haven't even mentioned it yet, before the 1980s, on the federal level, Labour had only won the majority of Victorian seats twice, in 1914 and 1929. Even John Curtin's giant 1943 sweep only won 9 of the 20 seats in the state. However, the 1980s would mark the beginning of the end for Victoria's blue status with 2 key figures. The first was John Cain Sr.'s son, John Cain Jr., who would deliver a crushing defeat to the 27 years of Liberal rule in 1982. Cain Jr. would then go on to win the 1985 and 1988 elections, absolutely crushing the records of his Labor predecessors. Meanwhile, on the federal level, in 1980, Victorian Labor would, for the first time in over 50 years, win more than 50% of Victoria's 33 federal seats. Like their state-based counterparts, Federal Labor too would hold this high watermark throughout the 80s, continuously winning more than 50% of Victoria's seats in every election in the 80s. Despite Labor's surprisingly good results through the 80s on both levels of government, Victoria would return to its blue state roots. On the state level, the Liberal Party finally hammered out an official coalition agreement with the now rebranded National Party of Victoria, thus strengthening their position. Meanwhile, the growing unpopularity with the Cain Jr. government saw the federal coalition once again gain the lion's share of the federal seats. This was then followed up 2 years later on the state level when Jeff Kennett won a resounding victory for the coalition. The coalition would then go on to dominate the elections of the 1990s on both levels of government, leading people to believe that Victoria was done with its 80s Labor experiment and had gone back to its historical status. However, in fact the opposite was true, and it was actually the 90s Liberal government who the state was about to be done experimenting with. It would all begin in 1998 when Labor regained the majority of Victoria's federal seats, which they have continued to hold to this day. Meanwhile, a year later on the state level, Kennett faced a surprising upset when what he thought was going to be a third-term shoo-in would result in a hung parliament in which Labor under Steve Bracks was able to court independence over to their side to form a government. Labor would then proceed to blow out their margins in the 2002 election and govern Victoria for the rest of the 2000s. Only in 2010 was the coalition finally able to secure an electoral win, thanks in part due to Labor's federal infighting. However, unlike the smashing victories of the Kennett years, the coalition leader Ted Baillieu had only just won the bare majority of 45 seats to govern the state. However, unlike Bracks, who turned his small 1999 win into a 2002 landslide, Baillieu would instead be forced to resign due to corruption allegations, and his successor, Dennis Napthine, would lose the 2014 election to Daniel Andrews, becoming the first one-term government since John Cain Sr.'s Labor government in the 1950s. And I think we know the story from there. Andrews would blow his small 2004 win into two giant landslides in 2018 and 2022, and as it currently stands, his successor Jacinta Allen is likely set for another big win come 2026. So, from looking at the history, we can see the change from a blue state to a red state began in the early 80s and was completed around the turn of the millennium. So let's look at the reasons why I think the change occurred. The first reason I theorise is the liberalisation of the Labour Party. While the term party switch is normally used in the case of the US political upheaval of the 1960s and 70s, it has in fact affected many countries across the world. Before the 1960s, the big political divide was between the poor blue-collar workers and the rich white-collar workers. However, the economic policies of the 1930s and 40s moving a lot of the former blue-collar workers into the middle class, the divide moved to more of a cultural one between social conservatism and progressivism. This was really shown in the Labour Party by Gough Whitlam, who moved the party away from its more social conservative views in order to gain the support of small L liberals and win the 1972 election. This move to court the more progressive members of society has also been adopted by the Victorian branch of Labour, which has greatly benefited the party. Victoria is arguably the most progressive state in the Commonwealth, and I don't think that came about in the 80s with the switch to Labour. If you look at the Liberals coming out of the state, they tend to all be on the more progressive side, like John Gorton and Andrew Peacock. Even the more conservative types like Robert Menzies and Malcolm Fraser had solid progressive sides when it came to multiple issues. Thus, with Labour cementing themselves as a small L Liberal party, they have now found much more success in calling over the more progressive communities of Victoria's white-collar class, as well as the ever-increasing numbers of younger Australians who are moving to Melbourne. In contrast, the coalition has moved more to social conservative views under the likes of Howard Abbott and now Dutton, and it has in some respects alienated the party from many Victorians. Since Peacock, a Victorian has never led the Federal Liberal Party. In contrast, since Hawke, Federal Labor has been led by 3 Victorians, one of which was a Prime Minister. Again, in contrast, we have not had a Liberal Prime Minister from Victoria since Malcolm Fraser in 1983. This is after 80 years in which the majority of Liberal Prime Ministers were from Victoria. However, we cannot entirely blame the Liberals' poor state in Victoria purely based on being shafted by the federal government, as the state's party also needs some blame. Baillieu being forced to resign halfway into his term is hardly a good sign for being the only Liberal leader in the 21st century to win an election. In general, the party's had weak leadership that has been unable to find a strong message which resonates with voters. This is also now helped by the party being torn between its historical moderate wing and its more reactionary right wing. It's kind of sad to see the branch which literally put the Liberal into the Liberal Party lose its way in the modern era, with the Labour Party now dominating the more progressive elements of the Victorian electorate. While I do think Victorians will eventually be done with the Andrews-Allen government and will in turn elect another Liberal Party, I really don't see it getting much traction, and I hardly suspect it would lose power in only one term. Heck, with the rise of the Greens in Melbourne's city centre, Victoria might end up like the Canadian province of British Columbia, where the Conservatives fold in with the centrist Liberals to fight the growing left-wing NDP. Could the Victorian Liberals fold into Labour to fight a powerful Greens party? Probably not, but it would be interesting to see where the state goes from here. With Melbourne growing ever more outwards, and the public really not showing much interest in the current Liberal Party, Labour's domination could continue to grow and whittle off the few federal seats the Liberals have left. Just recently we saw the Liberal Party fail to make any major gains in the Dunkley by-election, picking up only the voters of other right-wing parties that did not take part in the election. This unfortunately shows that the trend is still continuing, with the Liberals failing to make any sort of resurgence. Well, we're done talking about a state where Labour dominates. Now let's go to the state where, at least on the federal level, the Liberal Party dominates. Yes, next time we try to unravel the strange voting habits of the Sunshine State, as we try to find out why Queensland politics are so weird.